Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Hello, I'm Colonie Town Judge Peter Crummey, and welcome to Benchmark. We'll explore a variety of issues involving our legal system, our justice system, and how they relate to the citizens of the town of Colonie. Today we'll be exploring an issue which has had a significant impact on the Colonie justice court system during my tenure over the past 10 years, and that issue involves domestic violence. Many of our cases throughout the day and evening involve domestic violence, and we all recognize that domestic violence can take different shapes and forms, including physical violence and emotional violence. Our guests today wish to tell us not only about the different forms that domestic violence can take, but also encourage us to recognize that domestic violence can be different depending on the relationship that people are in. And today, please join me in welcoming Jennifer Storm, an attorney with the Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York, and also Phil Burse, who is a program specialist for the community group In Our Own Voices, located in the city of Albany. Jennifer and Phil, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Phil, tell us about In Our Own Voices and the focus of what the work is being done here on behalf of the community.
In Our Own Voices is a nonprofit organization located in Albany, New York, that work to promote the health and well-being of the LGBT community, the LGBT community being lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender, with a particular focus on people of color communities. One of the major projects that we do is the LGBT Anti-Violence Project for the Capital Region. Where we come in with our Rainbow Domestic Violence Legal Assistance Project, and we're making sure we're improving domestic violence services and resources for the members of the LGBT community. And yeah.
Well, that's certainly a larger issue involved in domestic violence, and I think that it appears that your position may be that not all domestic violence is the same, and society needs to recognize that depending on the relationship may depend on, it may have an impact on how people should look at the domestic violence and how it can be best responded to by the system. Is that a fair assessment of?
It's a pretty fair assessment. I do want to say that domestic violence is domestic violence across the board, whether you're in a heterosexual relationship or you're in a same-sex relationship. The tactics and the barriers often differ when you're talking about members of the LGBT community. Access to services or resistance by members of the community to access services because of fear of further victimization by an insensitive or not culturally competent criminal justice system or legal system. Yeah, criminal police.
Sure. Yep. Do you find that in the course of your education process throughout the Capital Region that you've had opportunity to do outreach to different groups in order to bring the attention of these issues to a variety of personnel, including the criminal justice system itself?
Yes, one of the things that we pride ourselves on and In Our Own Voices, we operate the only LGBT-specific domestic violence support line in the Capital Region, and then we also go out and do advocacy, education, and trainings to health and human service providers, students, legal professionals, and criminal justice professionals. And last year in 2009, we trained or educated over 200 of those individuals within the Capital Region. So we definitely make it our mission to go out and bring the issue of domestic violence in the LGBT community out of the closet, so to speak.
And I've noted that actually there is a continuing legal education on this issue that's being offered to attorneys, and also an outreach program that you've set up since November, which has no less than 10 or 15 community dates where people can also come and get more information about this issue. Is that correct?
Yes, we partner with Legal Aid Society of Northeastern New York and the Capital District Gay and Lesbian Community Council to provide direct consultation and legal representation to victims of domestic violence who are members of the LGBT community. And Jen is our attorney for that.
Yeah. And we're very fortunate to be joined by Jennifer Storm today, a graduate of Albany Law School, and here working on behalf of the Northeastern Legal Aid Society. And Jen, you have, from an attorney's point of view, an insight as to this community as well, and what type of barriers you see that exist in current law, which deserve attention by your legal efforts. And tell us what you see out there.
Well, in this current project, I'm basically doing both direct representation for victims of domestic violence who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. We're also educating Health and Human Service community members, doing the CLE, as you noted, and drafting a manual, which the Department of Health is going to publish for us, so it will exist long after our program is gone. But I've recognized that it's much harder to practice domestic violence work as a civil attorney for LGBT clients. And I've done broader domestic violence work for at least 2 years. The big issues I've found is that because same-sex relationships may or may not have any legal connection, they may have children, they may have shared resources, all the ways in which we would dissolve a heterosexual partnership or marriage are not necessarily available to me as tools. Now, the family court will let us in to get orders of protection. That's a relatively new law. So same-sex partners can go to family court and get that order to stay safe.
That's right.
However, let's say that an individual has been raising a child that is not biologically related to them and not adopted legally, but has been raising that child for a period of, well, in one of my clients' cases, 14 years. There's no standing to sue for custody or visitation. You're a legal stranger. That person could no more seek redress of the family court to see that child than I could, who's never met the child, despite the fact that they may have even been the primary caregiver. On the other side, you can't sue a non-biological, non-adoptive parent for child support, even if they were involved in the process of having the child. Let's say they were there for artificial insemination, they were at the hospital during the birth, they have in every way assumed responsibility throughout the child's life. Family court has no jurisdiction over a non-biological, non-adoptive child. Now, the caveat is that the Supreme Court has general jurisdiction, and I hope to be bringing the first case to the Supreme Court asking for child support, but it's a much greater barrier. Normally, people can access the family court system, particularly support, without an attorney, and they may not have an attorney available to them to seek financial redress. And I guess the other big issue that I see is people collaborate in their resources. When we form long relationships, we sacrifice career goals to raise children or to help our partner's career. The same thing we do in marriages. Now, divorce laws recognize that, and they give us equitable distribution of resources. We take a look at the parties, what they brought in, what they've accumulated, and we divide it equitably, usually roughly in half. Now, there's no equivalent system if you're not married. And since same-sex partners cannot be married in New York, there simply is no equivalent system. What we can do is a really archaic system called a constructive trust, where we can basically say that I was promised something, there was a contract, a verbal contract, I was promised something, and I relied on that promise by giving you my energy, my time, maybe my money, and I should be made whole. But it's a much more complicated litigation. I certainly couldn't attempt it without an attorney. And the results from it is not going to be half or even an equitable share of the fruits of the relationship. It's going to be a bare minimum to kind of put you back on your feet. So it's a really hard position to be in.
Jen, how do you think that the system would be best streamlined then in order to make opportunities more readily available in situations involving the LGBT community?
Well, a couple of things obviously I think same-sex marriage would go a long way, and no one likes to talk about divorce as a benefit of marriage, but it is. It's a benefit that we have, that society will recognize our efforts. But other things we could do, New York will recognize out-of-state marriages, but we don't recognize out-of-state civil unions. There's no way to dissolve them. They're not treated the same, despite the fact that in their state, they're intended to be the same. And that's a judicial decision. The legislature never ruled on it. If we did recognize them, that would go a long way. Honestly, updating the legal history on constructive trust. Like the whole idea that we have this law based in equity that theoretically could be true of heterosexual couples who have chosen not to marry. We could really update that and look at the way people share resources. And that, again, it's all judge-made law. That's common law, not legislative law.
Jen, do you see from in connection with LGBT domestic violence cases, are there any examples that you can give of why it's important to communicate education about the the variety of relationships which can have an impact on and the result of domestic violence?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the number of people who deal with a domestic violence victim, and I mean, every year there are presentations that go on called like In Her Shoes, where they walk through all the steps a victim has to take, which again assumes the victim is female. But all those steps apply to LGBT victims as well, except at every step of the way, they could be met by somebody who is actively homophobic, or they can be met by somebody who is not, but simply does not have a system in place to account for them, who wants to be helpful, but doesn't know how to ask the right questions, doesn't know the issues exist, and isn't prepared to deal with it. I mean, for instance, when the police arrive on the scene, and they arrive to a domestic dispute call, so their guard is already up, this is already a hard and chaotic situation for police, and they find that the domestic dispute is between two men. There has been a long history of, settle down, boys, this is a fight between equals, you go chill out, one of you go for a walk. Now, I really think we've come away since then, and frequently there will be arrests or they will take action, but I've still encountered problems. I had a client who, when he went to the police station and explained that he no longer had access to his home or any of his belongings, at first, the police were very much, we'll go in there, we'll give you a period of time to collect your stuff, and then you leave, which is how they'd handle it if a woman walked in. When they found out that the relationship was with another man, there was a problem. They decided they couldn't possibly tell whose clothes were whose, and he ended up walking away with his toothbrush and his cat, and that was the only items he was able to retrieve from that house.
Well, it's certainly had an impact, I imagine, Phil, on your own operation in considering placement for alleged victims as well. I mean, we're all familiar with shelters, and certainly the court system is no stranger to such functions as well. Does it ever have does it ever come up in a shelter as to placement, and are there placement opportunities for the LGBT community in a domestic violence situation?
Well, I will agree with Jen in stating that there has been a lot of progress made. People are trying to take active steps in being inclusive of members of the LGBT community. However, there are still a lot of barriers. Most domestic violence shelters only still accept women. They won't accept any men or transgendered individuals. Oftentimes, they place them in homeless shelters that aren't regulated often, and sometimes victims have experienced further victimization by members of the staff who aren't sensitive or competent on how to deal with members of the LGBT community, or by other people who are staying in the shelter. There's instances of rape, physical assaults, harassment, verbal abuse. So the person who is in crisis, who is trying to seek help, is being placed in a place that is further victimizing them. And oftentimes they'll return to their abuser or to their batterer, because that at least they feel safe with the batterer because they know how he or she is going to behave. They don't have to fear a stranger coming out of nowhere and assaulting them because they don't agree with their life or their lifestyle.
And additionally, New York state law expresses a preference that domestic violence victims be placed in domestic violence shelters because those shelters are deemed to have the training to keep them safe. So when you take people who are victims and you place them in a standard homeless shelter, you're putting them, even if they're safe in the shelter, you're putting them at risk from their abuser who may be stalking them, and you're also putting them with staff who haven't been trained in domestic violence.
Exactly.
Jen, the term has been, a couple different terms have been referred to today, and it may be to a benefit for our own viewers to understand. Transgender, transsexual, what's the difference? What are their definitions?
Okay, well, transgender is an umbrella term that we use to describe people who have various issues with gender identity. It's used to describe transsexuals, cross-dressers, people who, for whatever reason and in whatever way, sometimes choose to express their gender in a way that is different than their biological gender. Transsexual is a much more specific term. It refers to a person who was born in one gender and is uncomfortable with that and feels that internally they are of the opposite gender. And the American Medical Association recommends, they call it gender dysphoria, they recommend that the way to handle this is a transition for a combination of lifestyle and hormones, and sometimes, but not as often as people think, surgery, to live in the opposite gender.
Phil, domestic violence, as I said at the outset, certainly has visited the Colonie courtroom over and over. And in my 10-year experience, countless cases involving domestic violence. Do you think there's a higher rate or a different rate of domestic violence with heterosexual cases as opposed to LGBT cases? What's your position on that?
Studies are still coming in because, like we mentioned before, people don't really understand or deal with the LGBT community and domestic violence as often as they could or should. But as of now, the studies say approximately 25% to 30% of LGBT people in relationships have experienced or are experiencing domestic violence in their relationship. So that is comparable to heterosexual, the rates in heterosexual community. And one thing that Jen and I constantly discuss is LGBT people are people. So it's not like we're a separate subset where our numbers are going to be higher or lower. We are human. We go through many of the same issues and barriers and countless myriads of other issues so we're just like, let me correct myself, get back. Like we're saying, in striving for equality, oftentimes people don't want to discuss the fact that it's existing in our relationship because we're trying to get marriage equality. Yeah. We're trying to get rights to adopt children. So people don't want to discuss the prevalence of of domestic violence in our relationships, but it is there and it is comparable to domestic violence in the heterosexual community.
Our 10% of the population is really no better or worse than the rest of the population. And the one thing that distinguishes people, the sexual orientation or gender identity, does not seem to have any particular impact on whether people are, accomplished people, smart people, good people, violent people. The same rates generally apply.
Jen and Phil, oftentimes I'll see in domestic violence cases in my own courtroom that oftentimes alcohol or drug abuse is involved or in some way. Do you feel that likewise that it's involved in any of your cases, or would it be it just happens to be just there is no connection between domestic violence and alcohol and drug abuse? What do you think?
Well, I mean, I don't have the social science research at hand. I think Phil's better to answer that. I'll say I see it. When I was I used to work on a grant for homeless victims of domestic violence, so victims in shelter, and I saw it then, and I see it now on this grant. So yes, it's there, I don't know about cause and effect, though.
Right. And I would say that I would be cautious in saying that alcohol and drug abuse is a causation of domestic violence. It is indeed, as Jen stated, it's prevalent, and it's also always or often a factor in the instances of when the actual abuse is happening. But we have seen studies that show once the batterer has gone through drug and alcohol treatment, whether it's court mandated or not, they still continue to abuse the victim. So I would say that it is prevalent in a lot of DV cases, but it's not the cause of the abuse.
Phil, some of the work that you do, too, is certainly not just about the LGBT community alone, but also the LGBT community of color. And are there issues that affect that subset of people as well that may be different than other sets of people?
Yes. When you talk about marginalized populations such as the LGBT community and people of color communities, you see that there are cultural or social barriers that prevent them from accessing services, for reporting crimes or reporting instances of victimization. So I would say that when working with LGBT people of color, you're faced with additional barriers. You're dealing with, as Jen stated, homophobia from the legal system or police. You're dealing with racism or stereotypical behavior from people in these systems. And you're also dealing with oftentimes classism and sexism. So you're dealing with multiple layers of oppression and also internalized oppression. Once members of the LGBT community are constantly seeing that we don't have access to the same rights, you see people of color who are feeling that they don't have same institutional access. And so once you compound all of these issues, you may feel, okay, maybe I am deserving, or I don't want to go to the police because they're going to just harass me, or in seeking assistance, I may have to come out. And then you're dealing with all of the issues that come with coming out. You may lose your support network, you may lose family, friends, you have issues with employment, with coming out. So it's a lot of different barriers that not only LGBT people face, but then when you add the people of color piece to it, it's compounded.
Right, and you feel that there could be other reasons why people repress the violence because to otherwise make it public may expose them to some other societal issue which would have an adverse impact on them in another way.
Absolutely. I mean, whether it's that they don't want to come out as being LGBT, whether it's that their own community won't accept that, or whether it's that they are very involved in the LGBT community and don't want to come out as a victim at a time when everyone is desperately trying to prove that our relationships are worthy of marriage. I mean, privilege is a very interesting thing. We don't really think about it. When you're in the majority of a population, you don't think about all the ways in which you just expect to be treated a certain way. I mean, and as a Caucasian, I've lived my life as a majority member of the population, and I get treated a certain way. Once people know that I'm in a marginalized minority, you can watch the looks on their face change. You can watch the way they treat you change. So that I've gotten to have that experience walking both sides, but particularly for LGBT people of color, they're marginalized in two different ways, and either group might not accept them.
Phil, obviously in our own voices, 10, 12 years in the running?
Yes.
And tell me some other types of activities that you'll sponsor or be engaged in, and on top of the continuing legal education that you're doing with the Legal Aid Society. What other things that will your organization do to facilitate awareness, public awareness, and support for your community?
Well, when I told you earlier that our organization works to promote the health and well-being of the LGBT community, that was an abridged version. Our exact mission is to work for and ensure the physical, mental, economic, spiritual, political, and cultural growth of the LGBT community, with a particular focus on the people of color communities, as stated, dealing with the additional barriers that our community faces. We do that in a myriad of ways. We do that through advocacy. We are constantly meeting with legislators, assemblymen, senators, and talking to them about the issues that the LGBT community faces and the need to bring awareness and bring equality to our communities. We're constantly doing that. We also do trainings to organizations, health and human service organizations, schools, legal, criminal justice systems on cultural competency, domestic violence in the LGBT community, inclusivity, how to make your organizations more inclusive to members of the LGBT community, and sensitivity trainings. We also provide programs for members of our community to access. We have a trans care program for members of the transgender community, because they're also often further marginalized, because when people talk about the LGBT community, they're generally talking about lesbians, gays, and bisexuals. There's still a lot of ignorance and insensitivity around the transgender community. So we offer a transgender program. We also have a youth development program where we work with service providers from around the area who work with youth and making sure that they're being inclusive to LGBT youth who may be coming out or not coming out in their services. So we provide them with training and we collaborate with them on projects. We also put on Black and Latino Gay Pride, which is our major event. And that is an event aimed to link members of our community with all of the services that are there to them. Because as I mentioned, barriers, there are often barriers that prevent LGBT people of color from accessing services. We're one of the most medically underserved populations because of fear of doctors or fear of institutions in general because of historical due to historical reasons. So our major task with Black and Latino Gay Pride is to link up our community with service providers, economic, political, social, health and wellness, all of those things, in addition to entertainment. Yeah. So it's like we call it edutainment, so it's like educating them and entertaining them at the same time.
You do some pretty great music there.
Yeah, we do. We do have really good music and talent. It's an opportunity for our population to show that we are here. We do have talent, and we do contribute to greater society as society as a whole. So pretty much we do community programs, we do advocacy education, and then we do like social activities and events for members of the community.
Well, thank you. And Jen, tell us how you see the legal system in the future. What would you like to see in the legal system as you move forward?
I mean, there's a lot of things I'd like to see in the legal system on this issue as we move forward.
Yes.
But I have a lot of faith that we're getting there, because the cases are moving forward. People are starting to see that discrimination is discrimination. The biggest thing I'd like to see, though, we were talking about transgendered individuals, is that it is illegal in New York State to discriminate against someone based on sexual orientation. If I get fired because of my sexual orientation, or even perceived sexual orientation, I can sue, and I'll probably win if I can prove it. However, for transgendered individuals, there's no such protection right now. Governor Patterson has declared that state agencies won't discriminate, but you can be fired, you can lose your housing, you can lose custody of your children because of your gender expression and gender identity, and there's no legal protection. So I'd really like to see that change more than anything.
Is part of the difficulty, Jen, in a transgender situation that is it hard to identify or hard to prove whether someone's trans man or trans woman? I mean, how can they best identify who they are to be able to protect themselves?
Well, I mean, I guess if you couldn't identify them, then you couldn't discriminate against them. Yeah. Yes, I guess if they're keeping it internalized, it is hard to prove or hard to identify. But most of the people we're talking about are people who have taken steps. So for one thing, they could very much look like their chosen gender. For instance, a trans man is somebody who was born female but is through hormone treatments, surgery, just choice of dress, name change, is living as a man. A trans woman is someone who is born male and through those same things is living as a woman. They may get a job, have an apartment, be living their life in their chosen gender, but somebody discovers a document, someone hears some gossip, their social security card doesn't match, and at that point, everyone knows that they were born in the prior gender. And obviously, then it's even harder for people who don't necessarily pass, who are living in their chosen gender, but who, because of either they're at an awkward stage hormonally, or just some physical characteristics that they, large hands, large feet, being very short, people can tell. And those people are sometimes subject to the most just overt discrimination. What I think it is that our culture is really on a wave towards equality for gay and lesbian individuals. I mean, there's been setbacks legally and there's been advances, but polls show that most people, particularly younger people, do think that gay and lesbian people should be treated equally. People don't think you should be fired for your sexual orientation. We're not quite there yet with transgender. To most people, this is the new idea. It's kind of out there idea. They're not fully comfortable with it. And our culture is taking some time to assimilate it.
Attorney Jennifer Storm, thank you very much for being with us today. Phil Burse, Program Specialist for In Our Own Voices, located on Lark Street in Albany, New York. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy days and schedules to share with us some of your information concerning domestic violence in all areas of domestic violence. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm Judge Peter Crummey, and thank you for joining me on Benchmark.